I'm Daniel Ziblatt, and I'm going to be chairing the session. So this is part of our series that I co-chair with Peter Gordon, my colleague in the history department, who's also a resident faculty member here. Questions of Fascism and Democracy. Maybe I'll just, before we getting into today's event, just mention two other events. We're having a busy April. On April 16th, we're going to hear from Nancy Fraser on Is It Fascism? You can think about what the it might be. It's up for you to decide. And then on April 28th, we're going to hear from a PhD candidate from Harvard on Thomas Mann on patriotism as the love and critique of country. So that's in the same kind of general area, but with a kind of slightly different angle than what we're going to hear from today. So today I'm really happy to welcome back to CES Giovanni Capoccia, who was visiting scholar here, I think in 2009, 2010, was that about right? Yeah, so, really wonderful to have you back. So Giovanni got his PhD at the EUI, is the author of lots of important work, and has been working on the themes that many people are now working on now. He's been working on these things for a long time. So his book, Defending Democracy, which was published in 2005, really was a groundbreaking work, study of interwar Europe and responses of elites to, and parties and politicians to authoritarian threats. And so I think at the time he wrote this was a topic of important with a historical context, but over time the topic has become more and more relevant for the present day. And so this work has only grown in importance. And since then he's written the author of many articles on denazification and in general in this realm of the question of what can political leaders do in response to authoritarian threats. So rather than, so for most of Steve Levitsky and I both went to Berkeley together, UC Berkeley, and for most of our career studying democracy, we always focused on the structural determinants of democracy. And what I always appreciate about Giovanni's work, and even appreciate more so today, is the degree to what can political leaders actually do in the face of these threats? And are things really structurally predetermined? And so very much in that spirit, today we're going to hear from Giovanni on a brand new working paper, brand new paper that's just come out. That's part of a really important special issue of the journal Comparative Political Studies. And this new project is called Countering Illiberalism and Liberal Democracies. Back from the Brink, actually, is the title. Countering Illiberalism and Liberal Democracies. And is this special issue actually available yet? Because I know the way that these...
Yesterday.
Oh, wonderful. Perfect time.
Published online.
Yeah, perfect.
See about the paper.
Yeah, so there's a whole series of papers. Maybe you'll say a word about some of the other papers, and Giovanni wrote the kind of introductory framing paper for this special issue. So this is part of a broader research agenda that Giovanni's been working on for a while, but this is now a kind of new form. So again, welcome back. He's the author of many papers, many prizes. I won't go through all of them here, but really esteemed colleague here from Oxford University. I didn't mention that, so great to have you back. And then to comment on this, I'm very pleased to introduce my colleague Steve Levitsky. Many of you probably already know Steve, who's a professor in the government department, author of a very important book with a great co-author. Two books. I could say the same for Giovanni. Giovanni and I are also co-authors. So this is sort of funny to introduce co-authors. But How Democracies Die, Tyranny of the Minority, but also the author of Competitive Authoritarianism with Lucan Way. And Steve is the director of the Center for Latin American Studies here at Harvard. And so it's great to bring these different authors working on different regions but on similar topics together in conversation. So the way we're going to proceed is Giovanni's going to give us an overview of this important new paper, and we'll talk, and then after that we'll have about 10 to 13 minutes, I guess, of comments from Steve, and then we'll open it up for conversation. So again, welcome. Great to have you. So the floor is yours, Giovanni.
Thank you very much. Okay. So thank you very much, Daniel. Let me, get to the right file. It's really a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much. You said, thank you for the generous introduction. Thank you to Steve for acting as discussant. So I promise to stay within 40 minutes, so let me just get started right away. What I'm going to talk about today is part of the work that I've been doing to address these two research questions. What can be done and under what conditions these actions to defend democracy can be successful. The literature, as Daniel was saying, traditionally has focused on structures or on impersonal factors that would favor or disfavor democratic stability. Generally, these are long-term factors. They change very slowly. Recently, as also Daniel introduced 2 minutes ago, there's more and more attention to responses, to what can be done. Most of this literature is very uneven. In some subfield is very developed. Think about the European Union, think about, for example, the research on attitudes towards democracy and the various trade-offs that people may or may not do when facing an authoritarian option in elections. But it has, in my view, some problems, especially that on domestic responses. The first one is that the analysis often is pitched at the level of countermeasures, of specific countermeasures or mixes of countermeasures. More recently, there's also some work on specific sites of resistance to counter illiberalism. And there's limited attention to second-order conditions for viability and success. So oftentimes one reads first-order lists of desirable things that we should have in order to counter illiberalism. So the purpose of this paper and of the project of which the paper is part is to outline a research agenda on how to counter illiberalism in liberal democracies and when these actions to confront illiberalism are more likely to be successful. So this is the comparative political studies issue. This was published like yesterday or 2 days ago. Let me say something about the general outline, the contours of the project. First of all, the scope is liberal democracies. I won't go into that now in the interest of time. Sorry, I clicked the wrong thing. In the interest of time, the project puts front and center the theorization of democratic agency, as Daniel was saying. More precisely, the analysis of the conditions under which the initiatives of institutional, political, and civil society actors are more or less likely to be viable and successful in countering illiberalism. The focus of the theorization of the framework is on short-term countermeasures against newly emerging challenges. Short-term countermeasures are crucial, and yet they are not very well understood. Why are they crucial? This doesn't mean that long-term measures like civic education or redistribution or reduction of inequality or whatever you have are not important. Generally, in fact, these are crucial. These are the most important thing. In fact, though, if we don't pay attention to the short-term ways to counter illiberalism, by the time the long-term measures have effects, somebody else will be in government. So, there's a temporal inconsistency there. And so these two need to be studied together. And as Daniel was saying, we know much more about structural long-term factors than we know about short-term responses. Also, short-term responses, as I will say at the end of my talk, help conceptualize the long term. The analysis, and these are the two big points that the project makes, if you want, or tries to put out there. First of all, the analysis should be pitched at the correct level of abstraction. So the study of successful responses to illiberalism is not the search for a silver bullet. There's no magic formula out there. Measures are irreducibly contextual and also obsolescent, meaning as technology changes, as actors learn, challenges change, and therefore responses have to change too. Think about the importance of social media and bad algorithms today. 20 years ago, we didn't imagine that. And here, today, is probably the most important challenge that we face. Not individual countermeasure, but the range of viable countermeasures. So the room for democratic defense. This is what the dependent variable here is essentially. This is what this project focuses on. And the second point is that we should go beyond the current focus of much of the literature that is on resistance to backsliding. Especially when we think about the long term, illiberals may be in opposition as well as in government. So we need to think about this in terms of how to counter illiberalism, not only when they rule, but also when they are in opposition. I say that we should consider three scenarios. Before I do that, these are the articles in the special issue. Excellent colleagues, I'm very grateful to all of them. And this is also co-edited by me and Isabella Mares from Yale. I don't have time to talk about these articles, but we can talk about this in the discussion. So the scenarios. There's three scenarios, three ideal type scenarios. Illiberals can be on the rise, meaning, they come up through the ranks of civil society or political society, and this is when they are countered according to a logic of prevention. The illiberals might be on the brink of dominating executive power, and that's a logic of containment, or they might be in government, and the logic would be one of resistance. Now, the three scenarios are useful not only to organize, let's say, our thinking about how to counter liberals and what different strategies might look like in different scenarios, but also they provide an important criterion to define success against the liberal that we need to define, because this is the dependent variable of any such undertaking. So I take, there's various ways perhaps to define success, but I take two definitions, one minimalist and one maximalist. A minimalist definition of success is that illiberals are stopped in their tracks, essentially. So they, in a scenario of resistance, for example, a minimal success of pro-democratic forces would be to stop further backsliding. A maximalist definition of success instead would see the illiberals defeated, and therefore democracy switching to the better scenario for its stability. So in the case of resistance, we would be switching to a scenario of containment. Perhaps this will happen in Hungary or someday, we don't know. We're talking about this, but things are open, let's say. Okay, and still the same for the other scenarios. I won't go through all of them. So for now, I will talk about these two scenarios, resistance and prevention, because that's where the main theoretical point that I make in this article, the temporal paradox, applies. So when a new illiberal challenge emerges, either in a resistance scenario or in a prevention scenario, a temporal paradox shapes the possibility of countering it. What's the paradox? Well, at the beginning, I'll say something very general, and then I will talk about how this works in the two scenarios more specifically. At the beginning, the illiberals' intentions are concealed, and therefore there's uncertainty about their nature and the extent of the threat that liberal democracy faces. As they become stronger, as they advance in pursuing their goals, publicly usable evidence of their intention enhances the possibility of counteracting them effectively. But waiting to have more publicly usable information also shrinks, typically, the range of viable responses. And therefore, the likelihood of success. So, as it can be put colloquially, by the time you know for sure, it might be too late. Let me clarify this, get to the second stage of this clarification of this framework. So, information. Endogenous information on illiberal intentions comes from their activity. So the more they grow, the more they act, the more they operate in politics, and the more influential they become, the more they give away. The stronger an illiberal opposition party becomes in a prevention scenario, or the more a government backslides in a resistance scenario, the more they reveal about their intention. And the clearer the extent of the threat becomes. And this is information that is politically and publicly usable, not private information. I won't say more about this, but we can talk about this in the Q&A if you want. So let me just show you the graph. So graphically, essentially, if you put time on the x-axis and information on the y-axis, simply with the passing of time, there's no teleology, simply time is the dimension of variation of the growth of illiberals, information goes up. Countermeasures, as illiberals' rising influence and activities reveal their intentions, the range of viable countermeasures and possible synergies shrinks. So, little parenthesis, when I talk about countermeasures, I have this table in the paper. I'm not going to talk about this in the interest of time, but this is what I mean. There can be formal, informal, mobilizational strategy, the different actors and different scenarios, and so on. Let me go back to the dynamic within the scenarios, within the resistance and prevention scenario. So the two lines are in trade-off, essentially. So as information goes up, the range of viable countermeasures goes down. So if you set an exogenous threshold at the level in which, some notional level at which information becomes sufficient to trigger coordination and mobilization on the part of pro-democratic forces, they will have a certain level of countermeasures that is available. And that might or may not be sufficient to succeed against illiberals. So let me say something more about this trade-off. First of all, as you can see, the two lines don't cross, the two axes are on different planes. There's different actors, there's different logic between the two lines. Obviously, the two A and B don't necessarily need to be straight lines. They might follow different patterns. They might be, curvilinear. They might be, broken lines or whatever. But my point is that they will be in a trade-off. And why would they be in a trade-off? Because when pro-democratic actors react against the liberals, they have to abide by democratic rule of law and democratic values. Now, these values and the rule of law may be more flexible than we sometimes think they are, but they're not infinitely flexible. So, as the liberal actors become more powerful, it will be more difficult to stay within these limits and respond effectively. And that's why they are in a trade-off. Okay, so conditions for success. This setup allows to thinking about conditions for success at travel rather than specific countermeasures. So there's two exogenous factors that I focus on that influence trade-off, and these are exogenous information and institutional legacies. And again, I'll say something about these in general, and then I will look at the two scenarios more specifically. So exogenous information originates from something else than the liberals themselves. Okay? I'll give examples later on. It favors as additional information from with respect to what comes directly from the liberal. It favors earlier coordination, earlier interventions, and essentially softens the trade-off that we were talking about before, and therefore increases the chances of success. Because by allowing earlier intervention, it allows intervention when more countermeasures are available. Unfavorable institutional legacies have the opposite effect. And I'll say something more precise about this in a second. Essentially, they delay intervention. And therefore, they allow intervention only when the range of viable countermeasures is narrower than it would be even at the point in which information becomes sufficient without thinking about legacies. All right, so how does that work? This is the graph that I showed you before. Essentially, exogenous information simply adds to every single point of information of line A, adds a surplus of information. So the line shifts up. As you can see, so the line meets the exogenous threshold earlier and allows at the point in which it is possible to utilize a wider range of countermeasures. So let's see how it works in resistance, for example. We all know backsliding is gradual, legalistic, reduces government accountability. The endogenous information comes from what? Comes from the actions of the government. At the beginning, the initial reforms and initiatives are very unclear. They might be even observationally equivalent to democratic reform. As they accrue, it becomes clear what the intentions of the government are. By the time, though, they become clear enough, this might be too late. Okay? So exogenous information softens that trade-off, allows the opposition to intervene earlier at the moment in which more strategies and more, let's say, more room for action is available. Exogenous information can have different sources. In the paper, I give an example of diffusion that allows this intertemporal comparison. The example I give is Israel. So essentially, this is what we found by looking at Israel. There's a lot of evidence that the Israeli opposition at the beginning of 2023, when Netanyahu proposed these reforms, used as a cognitive shortcut the negative comparison with Hungary and Poland. So they said that in all possible ways. They said if we don't react now, in the future we will be what Hungary and Poland are today. And we will be that in the future because in the past, the Hungarian and the Polish opposition did not react as we should react now. That's the intertemporal comparison. As I said, they said that in all possible ways, from slogans in campaigns, from TV talks, from even 1-minute videos with constitutional lawyers, among whom Wojciech Sadurski, by the way, that were circulated on TikTok and other social media to the participants in demonstrations, where Sadurski and others explained that if the Israeli opposition didn't oppose the judicial reform now, that would be too late to do anything. It would be too late to do anything later. Okay, we can discuss more about the example. Let me move to prevention. Now, endogenous information in prevention comes from the fact that illiberal parties generally have a double discourse. At the beginning, they conceal their intention. This is what's called sometimes front stage and backstage in the literature. I'm writing a paper about that. As they rise in size and following, it's more difficult for them to keep their intention hidden, because it's more difficult to control sub-elites, especially if they expand quickly, because they are the object of more attention, and so on and so forth. So, again, by the time the nature of the threat is clear, they might have become so big that it's very difficult to do anything about them, to stop them. Some strategies simply become impossible to use. Exogenous information here might come again from many very different sources. I give the example of Germany 2024, but again, we can think of different examples. And the example of the corrective reportage of the infiltration, essentially, of a secret meeting of AfD figures with well-known neo-Nazis that declenched this wave of demonstrations against the AfD in the whole country. Now, this led to a dip in the poll of the party that then, however, was, the party went back up afterwards, but we can talk about that as well. Certainly there was a short-term effect. Okay, why is it that information matters? It matters because it facilitates, as I said before, coordination and mobilization. Coordination, why does it facilitate coordination? Among pro-democratic forces, of course. The uncertainty, the more uncertain the regime threat is, the more likely it is that different components of a potential democratic coalition will prioritize partisan preferences and values over the common interest in defending the regime. As information goes up, the payoff of favoring partisan goals goes down, at least relatively speaking. So again, this is not information that democratic leaders may have privately. I mean, they might know that X is an autocrat, and therefore they may want to do something about it, but they might face opposition within their own party or within other parties that can join a coalition against illiberals. That makes it impossible for them to organize coordination. As information goes up, the obstacles to coordination go down. Mobilization, well, we need to distinguish two things here. Mobilization of partisans, well, this is part of coordination, really, because sometimes the opponents to coordination are the basis of a party, or the basis of a faction of a party, or the base or some part of civil society organizations and so on. The more interesting one is what Milan Zvolik called centrists. So these are more pragmatic, less aligned electors that if, and this is of course is a gigantic if, they are sufficient in numbers, they might make the difference. Why is it a gigantic if? Because we all know from the literature that there's a lot of cases in which large part or significant parts of the electorate make a trade-off between their policy preferences and giving up protection of the market. So that's an empirical question. But as Milan himself shows, there's cases in which this type of electors are actually sufficient to make a difference. Okay, this is it for information. Let me go to institutional legacies. I'll be faster here. By institutional, I mean institutional and normative. I just abbreviated like that. What are legacies here? They're conditions for formal, informal, and mobilization countermeasures that pre-exist the challenge. So there's a list there. So if there's legislation against extremism already in place, if parties have strong organizations, if civil society is already strongly organized and strongly democratic and connected across levels of geographic and functional levels, these are favorable legacies. The lack of those are unfavorable legacies. Now, obviously, if you remember the table that I showed before, it listed a number of countermeasures for each scenario, but of course, not all countermeasures that are ideally viable are historically available. I mean, it shouldn't even be necessary to say, but it's good to make it clear. So it depends really on what type of legacies a country has when a challenge of illiberals starts. And so favorable legacies, what do? They allow quick enactment. As soon as that line A reaches the threshold, as soon as information is sufficient, countermeasures, the corresponding countermeasures can be enacted. And unfavorable legacies obviously create a problem, create friction. Passing a new law, organizing civil society, and so on requires time, requires resources, requires political capital, requires coordination, and so on. And so it requires time, essentially, so it decreases the chances of success. And so graphically, you just can represent this by a shift down of the B line. So at the same time, when information becomes sufficient, then the range of countermeasures is smaller. Why do legacies matter? What is the mechanism? They act as focal point. Okay? They are present, they are salient, they're in the mind of actors, they're part of the political landscape, they accept it secretly, and so on. Also, the focus on legacies explains, or goes some way towards explaining, the virtues and limitations of the structural dispute of democratic stability, because favorable legacies broadly correlate with established liberal democracies. So there is a correlation there, clearly. Courts and bureaucracies are better trusted and have a better reputation in advanced democracies than in unstable democracies. But it might be because of the specific legacies that are present at certain points in time facing a certain liberal challenge that these democracies are successful. And because democratic consolidation doesn't mean that the right legacies are available. I'm sure you're all thinking of an example here, right? The US. everybody thought correctly that the US was a consolidated democracy, and then Trump comes, and it's the perfect storm. Exceptionalist political culture, so no examples from abroad. Money in politics favors candidate, no party gatekeeping, and so on and so forth. Okay? Other point, resilience is not automatic. Even if legacies are there, they need to be activated, they need to be acted on. And that's, of course, that depends on the act. Okay, I'm coming towards the end. Containment scenario, very briefly, that's almost never associated with the emergence of a new challenge, even though perhaps it is. I was talking to Steve before, maybe I have to rethink that. It follows, is likely to follow either prevention or resistance, and therefore is part of a sequence of scenarios, that is the long-term analysis. The temporal paradox doesn't apply, there's no change of information, there's no change of countermeasures and so on. And the electorate is often split, generally 50-50, on the very meaning of democracy. This ambiguity is always present, but not 50-50, while in containment is generally close to 50-50. What to do? Well, it's a form of trenches warfare. Essentially, the Democrats stop the liberals from going to government while building for the longer term, and that's quite a difficult equation to solve. And ultimately, every way out is long term. You can read them there. The literature on this two ways out is not very well developed, and perhaps one thing to do in future research is to develop that literature. Very briefly on long-term analysis, I said before, this sets up the long-term analysis as a sequence of scenarios, sequence of episodes of confrontation within scenarios that can either be protected or go one after the other. There's some examples there. And the analysis should integrate the analysis of the short-term scenario in confrontation scene scenarios with the analysis of the long-term processes, allowing for the change of these variables that are instead constant in short-term confrontation. And the future of democracy may, in many cases, oscillate between containment and resistance, and possibly longer-term either transformation or perhaps even breakdown, but hopefully transformation rather than breakdown. Research agenda. The research agenda that emerges from this framework is quite multifaceted, and if you read the articles in the issue, you will see why. But essentially, the three main lines of research are those about legacies, information, and the conceptualization and the analysis of the long term, as I said before. Okay, so let me conclude. I think I'm within my time. Try to go fast. So, to understand, let me just recap a little bit. To understand why liberal democracies may keep the liberals from taking over, it is necessary to theorize democratic agency, the conditions for viability and success of certain forms of democratic agency. The analysis should be pitched at the correct level of abstraction, so we have to take a step back from specific context and focus on conditions that travel across space and time. We should broaden the perspective, not concentrate only on backsliding or resistance to backsliding, but also on countering illiberals when they are in opposition. We need to do much more work on analyzing the short-term counter strategies systematically, because long-term strategies are crucial, but we may never get there if we don't know how to do this in the short term. We need to research information, institutional legacies, and reconceptualize the long term as a sequence of episodes of challenges and integrate the effect of long term and short term variables. I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So Steve, do you want to stand or sit?
What do you prefer?
Whatever you prefer. Whatever you prefer. You like to stand.
Yeah, I guess so. Oh, is it possible to move it? Okay. So it's great to have you back, Giovanni. I was just before we got up on stage, I was commenting on how much time has passed since you were here. I noticed that we've both gotten a little bit grayer, but also
Still
Giovanni.
have hair.
Giovanni got. You cut in my joke, man. I think Giovanni's gotten taller. That's all right. This is a terrific paper, and I'm really privileged to read and comment on it. It synthesizes what has become a really vast emerging literature on democratic backsliding and on sort of how to reverse it. And let me start by highlighting what I really like about the paper. The first is this notion of a temporal paradox, which I think is right on. Giovanni points out that the more imminent the illiberal threat, the fewer options democratic forces have to combat that threat. When the liberals are in power, like the United States today, the most effective legal, institutional, policy options are often off the table. You cannot use the state to protect democracy when Trump controls the state. By contrast, when the liberal forces are still pretty embryonic, democratic forces have much more time, have a much wider range of strategies available. But the problem is that when the liberal forces are embryonic, it's hard to convince politicians and it's hard to convince citizens that they actually constitute a threat to democracy. So mobilizing a response gets really difficult. So the paradox is that the moments when we can most effectively prevent backsliding by nipping illiberal movements in the bud, at those very moments, it's hard to convince folks of the need to take action. Daniel and I wrote our first piece on Trump's threat to democracy in early 2016. Nobody wanted to publish it. Building on this core observation, which again I think is right on, Giovanni lays out three really useful scenarios, or usefully lays out three scenarios in declining order of threat imminence. So again, when illiberals are in power, you have a scenario of resistance. This is contemporary Hungary, United States, Turkey. When illiberals are not yet in power but pose a serious imminent or electoral threat, you've got this pretty widely recognized or commented on scenario of containment. This is much of, I think, continental Europe today. And when illiberal forces exist but don't pose an imminent threat to win power, you've got this scenario, interesting scenario of prevention. Maybe this is, I don't know, Canada and Uruguay. The paper does a really nice job of showing how the available strategies, how the most appropriate strategies vary across these scenarios. And one obvious takeaway is there really is no single recipe, no silver bullet for preventing backsliding. The appropriate strategies really hinge a lot on the context. And the paper does a nice job of cataloging these strategies. It occurred to me, though, that we probably should consider or add a fourth scenario, which is the sort of post-backsliding, the post-illiberal scenario. That's not just a reversion to containment, although it isn't. So if it is loses in Hungary, the day after, presumably, we go back to a period of containment. But the challenges aren't just containment, right? As the polls have learned over the last 2 or 3 years, there are pockets of illiberalism in the state that need to be vanquished, that need to be purged. That's a serious challenge. There are issues of accountability and justice that didn't exist in the containment period. And I think the difficulties that Polish liberal forces have faced, the limitations, the failures of the Biden administration point to the fact that this is a pretty challenging scenario in the immediate aftermath of a backsliding government. So I wonder if that's a fourth scenario. A few thoughts. First of all, the paper, as Giovanni laid out, discusses two factors that may help to sort of dull the trade-off between the imminence of threat and our capacity as a society to respond. Those are what he calls exogenous information and institutional legacies. Just a couple comments on each one. Exogenous information is basically diffusion. It's learning from other cases. And the idea is that by observing what's happened in Hungary and Venezuela and Turkey, that can accelerate the process of threat recognition in existing democracy. I think that's basically right. But I think we should recognize that there's often a fair amount of cognitive bias in how we interpret events in other countries and how we apply those lessons at home. I don't always agree with Kurt Weiland, but as he's shown pretty compellingly, we have a tendency to exaggerate the similarities between our own cases and our own, often downplaying or ignoring pretty meaningful differences across cases. The United States isn't like Russia. And Trump probably will not follow a Putin-like path to power. So although exogenous information clearly helps on balance, I think we have to be careful or have to be attentive to how political actors interpret and how they use that information. We don't want to be oblivious to threats, but there's a cost to exaggerating threats, moving to Canada, fleeing fascism. As violence shows, in the case of Latin America in the 20th century, more than a few democracies were destroyed during the Cold War due to an exaggerated perception of communist threat. Now, by institutional legacies, Giovanni means basically strong democratic institutions, independent courts, strong bureaucracies, professionalized militaries, and entrenched rule of law. Obviously very important. The Brazilian case shows us the importance of a strong judiciary. I think Trump 1.0, among other things, shows us the importance of a professionalized military. And Trump 2.0, and as a negative case, shows us the importance of a strong bureaucracy and civil society, something that Giovanni flagged but didn't spend much time on. The U.S. has, as we've seen, weaker bureaucracies, a much less developed civil service than most of Western Europe, and that left the United States, I think, much more vulnerable to politicization and weaponization of the state than countries in Western Europe. Obviously, the French, the German bureaucracies could be politicized, but I think it's safe to say it'll be harder and probably slower than in the U.S. case. Now, the paper, Giovanni makes a really important point on institutions, which is something that Daniel and I have been thinking about, which is strong institutions matter, but they have to be activated, right? Institutions are pieces of paper. They do not function automatically. People have to deploy them. And as Giovanni mentioned, one reason why the United States backslid so dramatically in the last year is that powerful institutional actors flat out abdicated their responsibilities. The Senate refused to convict Trump. The Supreme Court derailed the court cases against him and granted him immunity. The Republican Congress stood by silently last year as Trump subverted the Constitution and assaulted basic rights. Americans have been bragging about our constitutional checks and balances literally for centuries, and when the push came to shove and the time came to use them, we just blinked. And that raises the question, at least to me, of when institutions get activated and when they don't get activated. There's a lot of variation. South Korean and Brazilian institutions responded effectively, quite effectively, to assaults on democracy in 2024 and 2025, precisely at the time that U.S. institutions were failing. Why is that? Daniel and I have been thinking a fair amount about the role of collective memory, of memory culture. Koreans and Brazilians have a collective memory of authoritarianism. They know what it's like to lose a democracy. South Koreans remember the declaration of martial law in 1980. The repression of the 1980s is burned into collective memory, and it's reinforced in popular films and novels and culture. Brazilian elites remember military rule. The Supreme Court justices came of age under the dictatorship. They call themselves, or some of them, the majority, call themselves the generation of 88 in reference to the 1988 Constitution that put an end to the military dictatorship. So those guys, they took the threat to democracy seriously. I'm now skating an area I know nothing about, but Germans spent half a century building and institutionalizing a memory culture. And that may explain German society's pretty vigorous response to the scandal that you mentioned, Giovanni, in which AfD leaders were secretly plotting with neo-Nazis. Americans have no such collective memory of authoritarianism, and I think that slowed our collective response. All right, I'm now going to do what I guess I always do when I come over from the Center for Latin American Studies to CES, which is pound on the table and ask how the theory travels to the global south. This paper, and I think much of the literature on backsliding, draws very heavily on a handful of cases that are in or proximate to Europe, right? We talk incessantly about Hungary, Poland, Turkey, Israel, United States. But the vast majority of backsliding cases of the 21st century are in the global south. Venezuela, Bolivia, Ecuador, Honduras, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Tunisia, Nigeria, Benin, Zambia, Malawi, Madagascar, India, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Philippines, Georgia, Moldova, to name a few. We need to learn from these cases as well. And I think a few questions emerge as we expand the universe of backsliding cases. I just want to mention three. The first one is not a fair point because I know you want to focus on elite strategies, and that makes perfect sense. But when you look at the broad range of backsliding cases in the 21st century, wealth and economic development still matter a lot. There are still remarkably few successful backsliding cases in rich democracies. Hungary is one, although it's not among the richest of democracies. The United States is another case, although authoritarianism is far from consolidated here. Authoritarian initiatives, backsliding initiatives, are much, much more likely to fail or be reversed pretty quickly in rich democracies. Think of Trump 2020, think of South Korea, think of Poland, maybe Brazil as well. And that, I think, is a product of wealth. Having a big urban middle class, and a large, diverse, wealthy private sector generates what Luke and Wei and I call countervailing societal power, financial, organizational, human resources that opposition forces can tap into. That does not guarantee successful resistance, but all things equal, it makes authoritarian consolidation much, much harder. So backsliding isn't impossible in rich democracies. Nobody standing in the United States could say that. But it's a lot harder, and it's a lot more difficult to consolidate, less likely to consolidate. Second question emerges when you expand the range of cases. Party systems matter a lot. Giovanni's three scenarios framework, which I love, operates under the assumption that party systems are institutionalized. In Western Europe, illiberal threats have emerged relatively slowly over a series of elections. So the distinction, really useful distinction, between prevention, containment, and resistance makes a lot of sense. But where parties are weak, like in much of Latin America, the timeline is often much, much more compacted. 6 months before Alberto Fujimori was elected president of Peru, nobody knew who he was, and he didn't have a political party. Hugo Chavez was released from prison in 1994 because the elite was convinced that he posed no threat, he wasn't running a campaign, he had no organized movement, and no party. He won the next election. A year before Bolsonaro won the presidency in Brazil, very few observers inside or outside of Brazil thought he had a serious chance. Bukele in El Salvador, Correa in Ecuador, both came more or less out of nowhere. They didn't have parties, they didn't have movements, and so the time that you had for containment, much less prevention, was limited. So basic point is strategies of prevention, strategies of containment are much, much harder where an unknown illiberal politician can come out of nowhere and win the presidency. And that's true in much of the world. A third thing that you learn when you study cases in the global south is that backsliding is often pretty short-lived. We often think of sort of new autocracies as being like, I don't know, Xi's China or Putin's Russia, really robust and durable. In fact, the vast majority of new autocracies that emerged in the 21st century are fragile. And they're fragile in part because, unlike Hungary, they're built upon weak states. I'm talking, again, about countries like Bangladesh, Benin, Bolivia, Ecuador, Georgia, Honduras, Madagascar, Malawi, Senegal, Sri Lanka, Zambia. Governments with weak states, democratic governments or authoritarian governments, have a hard time governing. They fail to deliver economic results. They fail to control corruption. They fail to deliver decent public services. They fail to protect their citizens. And when autocratic governments fail to deliver the goods, just like democratic governments, they tend to face widespread public discontent, and very often they fall. So since 2014, sometimes people ask us to think about cases in which backsliding is reversed, and we think, oh, well, I guess we've got Poland. Since 2014, backsliding governments have been removed from power via elections or protest in Armenia, Bangladesh, Bolivia, Brazil, Ecuador, Honduras, Guatemala, Madagascar, Malawi, Malaysia, Nigeria, Peru, Senegal, Sierra Leone, Sri Lanka, Thailand, Ukraine, and Zambia. That is a heck of a lot of cases of reversed backsliding or U-turns and failed autocratization. We should study these cases. Quite probably the appropriate strategies will be very different, but I think expanding the range of backsliding cases can be very, very useful. I will stop there. Thanks.
Okay, so we now have time for questions. I mean, I'd like to give Giovanni the chance to respond, but I'd rather first maybe collect some questions and then you can respond to all of them. So please raise your hand. I'll call on you, and if you could just introduce yourself. So I'll start with Mark. Say who you are.
I will, thanks. I'm a second-year PhD student at the government department here in comparative politics. I have two questions. The first question, during the talk, and I know you got to the point, so not all finer points can be made, but there's like a conflation between illiberalism or liberalism and democracy. And sort of like one trade-off that I didn't feel was discussed much was the fundamental trade-off between maybe suppressing a majority or Democratic Party of today in order to secure the liberal principles of tomorrow. And I feel that when these two, I like the title and the style of it, illiberalism and focusing on that, but when we jumble the two together, maybe we're obfuscating a bit the trade-off we're actually making, that maybe some voters, their preferences are deemed illegitimate or something like that. The second point or question is on the theory, the framework that we're given here that is very interesting. Is this a framework specific to liberalism, or is it a general framework of regime transition? Because it seems that this framework equally could be applied to an illiberal regime where there is some sort of contender, like the whole spatial logic is somewhat similar. So is there, just in that framework, is there something specific to liberal democracies that we should be thinking about? Or
So I'll just get one more question because there's a lot of hands, and otherwise I'm afraid we won't go through. Federico.
Thanks so much. I am Federico Fabrini. I'm a law professor in Dublin, Ireland, and a Fulbrighter here at the Kennedy School. I come from a different field, but I thought what you presented was really very interesting, also from an interdisciplinary perspective. And the question is whether we lawyers should take up something of what you said and change some of the benchmark we use. And I'm thinking here the issues of the banning of political parties, which has been litigated in Germany, among others. And as you will be aware, basically the German Constitutional Court developed a standard that, without using your axis, really reflected the same logic. So the German court said the NPD, the neo-Nazi party, has no potentiality of being a threat to democracy, and so we're not going to ban it, which is, I think, exactly showing the logic. We could ban it, and it would work now, but there's potentially, we don't see any threat there. And I wonder whether your lesson is we should actually drop that potentiality assessment in the evaluation of the legality or constitutionality of a party and go hard right away. Is this ultimately sort of a rule of thumb for lawyers to rethink some of these standards? And sorry, I'm pushing you in a different field, but I just thought it really challenges some of the assumptions we are using in legal assessment.
Okay, one more question, if I might. Jenny Mansbridge. Yeah.
Oh. Later in the line.
I think you were next.
I'll follow up on that first question that was asked that suggested that some of these illiberal moves are supported by a majority of the people. And what do you do in that case? And I hadn't noticed very much attention in your analysis to the underlying causes, possibly, of, for example, immigration. Piketty talks about the takeover of the left parties by the professional classes, who kind of could care less about immigration. I mean, immigration's wonderful for professional classes. So how do you apply this We've known about immigration for quite a while. The information has been there that the working class is against immigration. So it's there. How does your analysis apply to some of those underlying clauses?
Should I?
Yeah, you can pick and choose.
Okay, no, well, I'll try to go in reverse order because it's probably easier. How do I deal with the causes of discontent that might lead people to vote for the liberals. These are long-term factors, meaning we may all agree that the elites were wrong about immigration, and so there should be a policy that stops immigration or reduces it significantly, and expels every clandestine, every non-legal immigrant. How long does it take? It takes a long time. When there's a threat at the upcoming elections that are in a year, or in 6 months, or in 2 years, even starting to do that will not have an effect on that election. So the way in which I look at this is that some causes might be very deep, and they are very compelling. I'm not denying that at all. They go under the rubric of long-term causes, and that need to be addressed. But if we don't pay attention to the short term as well, by the time that addressing these long-term causes will have had an effect, somebody else will be in government, probably an autocrat. So that's what I would respond to that. What do you do if the majority of the people support an autocrat? Well, not much, unfortunately. My whole point is that you should start before it's a majority of the people that supports an autocrat. In fact, you can do something. Again, I go back to that big table that I put up. It's in the paper anyway. And you will see, if you look at that the list of things that you can do in a situation of resistance is very meager vis-a-vis what can be done in principle in a situation of prevention. So there's something you can do, but the more you wait, and the more people are in favor of the autocrat, the less you can do. So that's how I would respond to that. The 2017 judgment on the NPD by the German Constitutional Court. Yeah, frankly, I did not understand that, but it's just, it seems that, like many courts around the world, judges have a hard time dealing with politically divisive issues. So they try to get out of that as they can. And if they do that in Germany, you can imagine how they do it in other countries. I remember a case in which I think it was in the 90s, another party was not, so the Constitutional Court said that a small extreme right-wing party did not fall into the realm of competence of the court because, yeah, it was called a party, but it wasn't really a party. And so it could be banned by an administrative decree, which was done. But that's another way to, shun, to shirk the problem. So changing the benchmark, yes. Unfortunately, though, constitutional courts don't really listen to political scientists. Maybe to Daniel and Steve, but not in general. So I don't know what to do. But certainly, yes. I mean, if there was more attention to this, to how these things work, probably they would change the benchmark. About whether it's legitimate to suppress a majority to ensure the liberal principles of tomorrow, that's your question. Again, if it's a majority, it's very difficult. It's very difficult to claim legitimacy in saying, well, I'm stopping you from going to power because you might break down democracy, and therefore that's an absorbing institutional state, and nobody will have a chance to. These are very hard choices. I don't have a recipe, but I can see the good on both sides of these choices. So, but it becomes really a normative argument, and as you know, the normative literature is divided on this. Okay, Steve. First of all, thank you very much. These are great comments. Let me see if I can address the ones on the global south, because that was very, very interesting what you said there. Okay, wealth and economic development matter. Yeah, they do, right? They correlate with legacies. When your exceptions to that rule are Weimar Germany and the US, that rule seems a little weak to me. I mean, we can list a lot of cases, but these cases are not of the same importance because the US and Weimar Germany at the time had an influence on a lot of other cases around that Armenia, Belize, blah, 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 would not necessarily have. So I completely take your point. You're right. There's a correlation there. There is no doubt. But when the accessions are so important, then we might need to think about something else. And so go beyond that correlation and try to look under the hood and see what's doing the work. Party systems matter a lot, and that's a great point. You're absolutely right. And you're right that if the party system is non-institutionalized, is non-structured, and votes move and very quickly between different leaders, and politicians enter very, very easily, very quickly. And then you don't have the linear. But I said that line is just a crude simplification. You may or may not have a smooth rise of illiberals in a liberal democracy. So even if you cannot act in terms of prevention and containment just because you don't see the challenge at all, right? You can still act in terms of resistance. So once Fujimori went to government, then he started breaking down democracy, then what can you do? So that part of completely take your point, but that part of the framework I think is still applicable. About the fourth scenario, then I stop, so we'll give space
We
to
have
others.
8 people who want to ask questions, so we can, yeah.
8 people. So
Yeah,
I'll stop here.
yeah.
Just say on something on the fourth scenario, post-resistance. It's not a fourth scenario, it's the long term. So short term are single scenarios. And containment is never short term because it either comes after prevention or after resistance. So if you have containment after resistance, like in Poland or like in any of the many other cases that you mentioned, that's a long-term analysis. Then you have to see how the scenario that was there before influenced the scenario that is there now. So
Great.
I'll shut up
Okay,
here.
great,
Thank
yeah,
you.
thank you. Yeah, so I'm going to collect as many as I can, and then we'll see if we can get Muriel here. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Giovanni. I appreciate the amplitude of views and the comments. It's really great. Lesson of comparative politics. I'm a professor of political science in Nantes, and I'm visiting fellow here. So as I was trying to wrap up my mind around all your cases and variables, let me submit a case to you and see how it works with your model. How would you consider Roosevelt in 1935? And a liberal, but whose intentions, I agree with you, may not be clear. And behind my question is a kind of course, maybe a normative concern about what kind of illiberalism are we dealing with? Do you consider making types of illiberals? And because you were not defining illiberalism, but you were defining the intentions of illiberals. So I think maybe there's some things to clarify, and I think that case maybe would help me at least understand your model.
Great, thank you. Samika.
Thanks. My name is Michael Costa. I'm visiting scholar here of political scientists from Lüneburg in Germany. And actually my question just is a follow-up sort of to Muriel's. Because you not only do not really define liberal parties, you treat them as static. And this came as a surprise to me in a paper which paid so much emphasis to temporalities. The illiberals are there and they remain illiberal. Don't you think they could moderate? And wouldn't that also be a way of countering or approaching, I would rather say, them? Because if the framework as I understand it makes the populist or anti-democratic assumption of this Schmittian assumption of the friend and foe framework a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because the illiberals are there and we need to fight them. And I think someone else has said that already. And I think this gives too much ammunition to those who indeed fight more. And to give you just an empirical example, what was the difference when the Freedom Party in Austria governed twice over the last 20 years? They went under coalition. I would say, for Austrian democracy, I would say nothing really. The state of Austrian politics remained, as the natives say, hopeless but not serious, as before. So and so maybe, you know, under certain, this is really just an illustrative example, right? I'm not telling you the Freedom Party is a vanguard of democracy, not at all. But, you know, under some conditions which are worth exploring in this framework you came up with, you might be able to like moderate the liberal parties. That would be my, well, point or question. Thank you.
Luka Pavicevic, junior historian government. In the paper, you speak about the limits of formal countermeasures in resistance scenarios, and then in footnote 33, you say something very interesting, and I quote, in presidential systems, the legislature can resort to formal measures if the liberals only control the executive. And this seems to me to be going counter-lens and the perils of presidentialism and the whole line of that view. And I just wanted to hear more about, you know, illiberalism in presidentialism versus parliamentary republics.
Hello, my name is Maria. I'm a sophomore at the college studying government and economics. It's a pleasure to meet you. One thing that I took from your talk is that information is incredibly crucial, and to me that speaks to the role of media in civil society. And I think that there are quite a lot of cases where robust civil society can actually reinforce independent and actually fragmented out of a center media, which actually makes information available. I think that a lot of like post-Soviet republics are examples of that. But at the same time, these are also countries that have institutions that are not favorable. So that to me means that the institutions are not responsive, even though information might be available, which just means that they might favor, as you said, partisan problems. And my question is, if we have the civil society and the media present to deliver information, but we have institutions that are not favorable, are we just doomed? Are we just in a deadlock? Thank you.
Okay, we have so many questions. I think you're not going to be able to answer all of them, so you're going to have to pick and choose, I think. We're supposed to officially end at 3:15, although that seems kind of quick, so I don't know, people have to leave it. If we may go a few minutes longer if you're okay.
I can say something.
Okay. So, Jay, I'm trying to do this in sequence. Jay Gorszak.
Great, thank you so much. Grzegorz Rykiel, Government Department. The one thing which I missed a little bit is to thinking about institutional strategies. And I'm thinking that Poland and Hungary are excellent examples of how illiberals are protecting their illiberal system, right? So what far right did in both countries, they just simply restructured institutions, being prepared for losing power. They appointed people to every single position they could appoint people. They changed the rules of the game by saying, okay, this person cannot be removed from the office for the next 4 years, or the removal needs to be agreed by the president of the country and so on. So they built the whole protective institutional cocoon. That is why, you know, the liberals in Poland cannot do anything basically. And I'm afraid that the same will happen in Hungary if the opposition wins the election on Sunday. So I think thinking about institutions and what can we do in order to protect democracy is probably one of the things that should be on the agenda.
And so what this would suggest is Steve's point about the fourth scenario, that may be a qualitatively different situation than just the long run. I mean, it's not sort of starting over. So, but okay, I'm going to get one more question in. Paul Tucker, you are next.
My question actually flows very nicely from that Paul Tucker Kennedy School. But the paradox that you described, which is really a dilemma between crying wolf and too late, is very familiar in other fields. But my question is this: I thought there was something potentially missing from the resistance strategies, which is while Liberal Democrats hold the reins of power, putting in place, if you like, booby traps. These are sources of resilience that, if swept away, turn out to be salient. It turns out that politicizing the court over many decades isn't salient. The squirming around the Federal Reserve, squirming in the administration, and squirming in the Supreme Court shows that they fear immediate backlash from the markets. Elizabeth Truss, a libertarian prime minister, suffered this in the UK. No, you'd expect the markets to be on her side, libertarian. She swept away the institutional constraints and unleashed the market constraints. And the specific example doesn't matter, although has an amusement value because left liberals don't like markets most of the time, but they might protect democracy in certain states of the world. But I think your menu didn't include things that governments can do to protect the system if the illiberals get into power, which is the exact mirror image of, I mean, in a sense, the illiberals have been better at that in Poland and maybe Hungary than certainly the US administrations have been, and arguably others in Europe.
So before I turn it back to you, Giovanni, let Steve, there was one thing you wanted to maybe respond to, and then.
Well, I want to speak very briefly to the presidentials and parliamenters, but I think we should.
Okay.
I can go
Okay,
after.
okay. Go
Yeah,
ahead,
no,
go
no,
ahead.
again, I'll take them back to Paul. Okay, two things, right? Markets are probably the only thing that autocrats fear. I'm not sure that markets are always protecting democracy, but that's. But about the locking in fact, that strategy is in that table. It's called preventive legalization, meaning when Democrats see that they're losing power, they might try to lock in things legislatively. Of course, the autocrats, if they have the majority, they have to change legislation, but at least they won't be able to do it silently. So that's the. But it's true, and that Drago's point, illiberals are very good at doing that by appointing loyalists everywhere, making it very difficult to reverse things. Again, this is that responds also to you, Darian. This is the fourth scenario, right? So it's part of a sequence of scenarios. And of course, in a sequence, what comes afterwards is influenced by what comes before. But that's not exactly the same theorization that I'm doing here, even though that kind of helps build it up. But I'm working on that, and these are all great points because these are issues that need to be tackled. Okay, let me see what.
You can choose to respond to what you want.
Yeah,
You don't have
yeah.
to
No, I mean I
all
can
you
respond to everything, but I don't want
Yeah.
to keep Steve
Yeah.
because he has to go.
Yeah.
Okay, a liberal party is static or not? No, I don't mean that the liberal parties are there forever illiberal. There's no sense in which I say that. If an illiberal party stops being illiberal, then there's no threat to democracy. Things are fine. Treating an illiberal party or a party as illiberal and targeting it as illiberal, does it turn a non-illiberal party into an illiberal one? That's an empirical question. I don't know whether this is true all the time. As I don't know whether that accommodating an illiberal party or a possibly illiberal party is always the best thing to do, because otherwise they will turn illiberal. This is an open question. What I will look at is the goals of the party itself, and this is what is difficult because they generally are concealed from the very beginning. So that's what I was getting at there. Muriel, Roosevelt. Okay, if you compare, when I did think about Roosevelt and what he did, and how he expanded the state, threatened to pack the court, and so on, I will put him under the rubric, especially if you look at him in his years, in the context of those years, under the rubrics of what I call the flexibility of liberal democratic institutions and values. So Roosevelt was not a bad actor in a certain sense, right? If Trump were doing the same thing as he is in a certain sense, then you should all be much more worried about that. But of course, how do you know in advance? You don't, so you take the risk. But of course, Roosevelt wasn't Hitler, wasn't like the European autocrats that were breaking down democracy at the time.
I said I'm going to write that down. Roosevelt wasn't Hitler. That's one thing I will take from this. Yeah, I'll cite you on that one. Yeah,
No, I think that's
okay, is that, okay. Do you want to?
So really quickly, I'm sorry, your name is? No,
Mikhail. Michael.
Sorry. That, what you say suggests that there, in this medium scenario where illiberal forces are on the rise, there's also potentially a strategy of cooptation.
Yeah, or accommodation, yeah.
As opposed to containment, right? The Austrian-Dutch strategy. And I'm not a Europeanist. It seems to me the jury is still out on the, because it is true, it is certainly true that there are multiple cases historically of authoritarian parties that keep their intentions and goals hidden, but parties' goals evolve all the time. And sometimes you just get used to being in power and liking winning power, and you give up on other goals. So I thought that was a good point. I wanted to very briefly take up the presidentialism and parliamentarism question, because it's something I've been thinking about a lot, comparing the U.S. and Western Europe, and be very interested to see what Giovanni thinks. It seems to me that Aaron Leipart was right, that one could make a case that parliamentarism and PR, all things equal, are better positioned to defend themselves against the liberalism than particularly presidential or parliamentary systems with plurality electoral rules. And this speaks a little bit to Jenny's point, because without question, there's a normative issue when majority support illiberalism, and Bukele in El Salvador, there's nothing you can do. But I think we sometimes overstate the degree to which ethno-nationalist forces in rich democracies constitute anything remotely like a majority. They don't. In rich democracies, at least thus far, usually there are 30-ish% of the electorate. And the key question is how that 30% gets translated into political power. And it seems to me the U.S. is a worst case scenario, because our institutions allow that 30% to govern alone. And that's much more difficult in a parliamentary system with PR. In a parliamentary system with PR, that 30% can be an important political force and shape politics, but you either get junior partner in government, sort of an Austria or Netherlands scenario, or opposition, or even a senior partner in government as in Italy. Thus far, the outcomes have not been so terrible. So obviously, a lot of history remains, but it does seem to me that all things equal, it is harder to translate that illiberal 30% into really damaging power in parliamentary systems of PR.
Let me just get two more questions and then give you the final word.
Okay,
That's okay.
yeah,
You can then,
I'd like to respond to
let me first start with Manas, and then Charlie, and then Alexandra. No, you're fine. Manas first.
Thanks. I'm a political scientist at TU Dresden. Thanks very much for your talk. So I wonder how this all relates to the motives of actors and the outcomes. And my concern is that the framework might overstate how important these short-term countermeasures are for liberal actors and also for the outcomes that we observe in the face of possible alternative explanations. So you basically imply that it's key for, let's take the Hungary example, for Magyar to save democracy. But what about just office seeking, the normal assumption we would have in the party politics literature as incentive for political actors to act? Why shouldn't that be more relevant for him than some short-term countermeasure of saving democracy as a system? Can we empirically disentangle that? Does it matter? Is this a problem for your framework? And more importantly, maybe when it comes to understanding outcomes. So I think based on your framework, we would basically assume if Orban lost, it was a successful strategy of countermeasure of resistance, I suppose, according to your framework. We would less focus on maybe, okay, Orban just lost because of economic reasons or corruption scandals. So my basic question is, what about alternative explanatory approaches that might explain specific outcomes that may bear more relevance than the short-term countermeasures that you postulate?
Okay, then the final question from Charlie.
Thanks. Part of my question has been echoes, I guess, Michael's. The line between short-term and long-term to me seems often rather fictitious. As the Italians say, appetite comes with eating. So some of these parties have ambitions, and yes, there are ways of distinguishing really nasty characters. In 1930, Hitler said at a trial, an open trial, when I'm elected, heads will roll. the agenda was there, but we're dealing with people whose agenda is I think less overt. And I think solving this problem of blip versus trend is difficult. And I'm not sure just to say they're long-term and short-term. We say they're long-term when we look back. We never quite know long-term.
Yeah, when does the short term become a long term?
And the other thing is, obviously, so many of these issues depend upon the non-political sphere or the wider political sphere, and that is the economy, certainly in many ways, and how you decide whether interest rates should go down, the economy should be expanded or not expanded, is going to have a tremendous impact. So I would just open up the number of causal possibilities in this.
So final word for you.
Okay. Lots of great points to answer. I mean, Charlie, I think you're right. Short term, long term is a kind of an analytical distinction, but it's very difficult then to pinpoint it empirically. I would say when certain background variables that in the short-term confrontation are constant, they start to change, then you're in a different game. So that's what I would say, but we can talk more about that just in the interest of time. About the motives of actors, I'm not sure I follow that. So if Magyar doesn't restore democracy, and we know that there are many difficulties for that because of what Grzegorz was saying, then the system will, and he has no intention to restore democracy, then it would just be another autocrat that continues to rule on autocratic basis like Orbán does. If he wants to restore democracy, then he will face the obstacles that Steve was talking about for the fourth scenario, and I was framing in terms of long-term analysis. About office seeking and other motivation, I don't imply at all that whoever defeats an autocrat has to do it necessarily under the banner of saving democracy. Generally, in fact, in every case, almost every historical case that I know, there's always a mix of motives and a mix of strategies in electoral campaigns. Some of them might be regime strategies, let's save democracy. Many of them might be, issue strategy, violence issues or, position issues and so on. So let's, decrease unemployment, and that's popular, and then I get elected, but I'm also a Democrat. And therefore, I will start dismantling what the illiberals have put in place. But these are all empirical questions. I'm not assuming any of that in the framework. Steve, about the PR parliamentary versus majority. I mean, on the goals that evolves, you're right, and that's part of also my response to the colleague before. This goes under the rubric of what I call transformation or realignment. But that's not going to happen in the short term. I think that in the long term, democracy will oscillate between containment and resistance, with every prior scenario influencing the next. At some point, there might be a total realignment with maybe evolution of the goals of the liberal parties that would turn into a no more conservative opposition, perhaps, on a slightly changed set of normative and institutional basis that, however, may preserve, I hope at least, the basics of liberal democracy that essentially are individual autonomy and some accountability for who governs. So that is possible as a scenario, and in that context, I would certainly see as a possibility that goals may evolve. About the PR versus majority, you're right, but the 30% effects, okay, so the 30% that doesn't govern alone, they are non-linear effect. So you don't need to get, also in PR and parliamentary system, think again about Weimar, okay, it was a semi-presidential system, but the president was not a friend of Hitler. Hitler was called at the chancellorship after losing an election with about 30-ish% of the vote. So you can, and that was a complete proportional system. The more proportional that you can possibly imagine. So the point is not to bang on about Weimar, but there might be non-linear effect once you get to a certain level that is probably about 30% or about just above that. So that's what.
Well, I think all conversations have to end with Weimar. So thank you, Giovanni Capoccia, and thank you, Steve Levitzi.